Now we're going to look at how graphs get moved left and right. So in this graph of y equals cos x minus pi over 6, it's just asking us to say what the phase shift is, what's the translation, and for A we can easily say this has been translated left or right with a negative in there. It will go to the right. So our graph is going to be shifted pi over 6 to the right. What does that look like? Well, it says sketch the graphs of y equals cos x and y equals cos x minus pi over 6 for 0 to 2 pi. Again, for both of these graphs, our maximum is 1, our minimum is negative 1, because there's no change in the amplitude. For a regular cos graph, we have a period of 2 pi, and you could divide that into 4 equal sections. Cos graph starts at a maximum, so it goes maximum, center line, minimum, center line, maximum. And we'll label this green one as y equals cos of x. Now to shift something pi over 6 to the right, the hardest thing is for you to determine where pi over 6 is going to be on this graph. If you think of pi over 6 as 30 degrees and pi over 2 as 90 degrees, you might be able to say, I should separate this little section from 0 to pi over 2 into thirds, and pi over 6 would be 1/3 of that. Now, if I'm shifting everything pi over 6 to the right, I've labeled this pi over 6 here, but what I'm going to do is take that spacing and just mark all the way along here that shift of pi over 6 to the right. And then I can take my maximum point where it starts and shift it over. This point will shift over pi over 6. This point shifts over pi over 6. And so every point shifts pi over 6 to the right. And now that black graph is y equals cos x minus pi over 6. Now, one thing that's going to be different on the way that this one is worded compared to your final exam. Your final exam, if they got you to sketch the graphs of cos x and cos x minus pi over 6, they would probably say for at least one period. That allows you to stop your graph if you wanted to, or continue it, and you wouldn't lose marks if you forgot arrowheads as long as you had at least one period on the graph. The way that this question is worded, I technically would lose a half a mark here because I've graphed too much. It said only graph it for 0 to 2 pi. So I shouldn't have arrowheads on the end, and I should stop it right there, and I should go here and stop it right there. That would graph it from 0 to 2 pi. But I think for us, for graphing, I would leave your arrowheads on them if you have them on your notes already, because we're just showing that what do we do? And if you didn't have this point here, it gets a little bit confusing on exactly what's happened. So I like that we've added arrowheads and we had these continue. For this graph. All right, questions you can do for practice. Are 3, E, and F.